I've been thinking about the way people talk about climate change, and it's something that gets really sensationalized. Bill Gates put out a statement recently that I think is worth looking at closely. He said essentially that climate change will have serious consequences, especially for people in poorer countries. That's true. It's a real issue. But he also said something that gets lost in the headlines. It's not going to cause the end of humanity. People will still be able to live and thrive in most parts of the world for the foreseeable future. And that's, I think, a very important perspective that often doesn't get emphasized. A lot of people frame climate change as an existential threat, like, if we don't solve it right now, everything is over. And that's not how reality works. Humans are incredibly adaptable. We innovate, we find solutions, and we survive challenges that at first seem insurmountable. That's what people often forget when they get caught up in worst-case scenarios. So yes, climate change matters, but the conversation has to be about how we actually improve human welfare. How we make sure the most vulnerable can thrive. That's where the focus should be. And if you look at the bigger picture, climate change isn't the only threat. Humanity has always faced major challenges: poverty, disease, access to energy and resources, and those are still urgent. It's easy to get caught up in debates about carbon or emissions targets and lose sight of what really affects people's lives. So while addressing environmental risks is important, it has to be done in the context of solving real human problems. That's where technology and innovation come in. Gates talked about this in an interview, saying there's enough innovation to prevent truly catastrophic outcomes, even if we don't hit the most ambitious temperature targets like 1.5 or 2 degrees. And he framed it in terms of overall human welfare, which I think is the right way to approach it. You're not trying to scare people, you're trying to find effective, practical solutions. And that's exactly how humans have always overcome big challenges, through science, technology, and problem solving. Of course, there's a political angle too. Some people reacted loudly, including former President Trump, framing Gates' statements as proof that alarmism was wrong. That's politics. It's loud, it's simplified, and it often misses nuance. You can acknowledge that without taking sides. The key point is that the real question should be, how do we address risks in a way that maximizes human welfare, not who looks right or wrong in a headline. Then you have activists, people like Greta Thunberg and others, who've devoted their lives to raising awareness. I understand that if someone like Gates shifts their position, it can be confusing or frustrating for them. But again, the goal shouldn't be ideological loyalty. It should be improving human lives and addressing real risks effectively. That's the focus that often gets lost in heated public debates. Online, of course, there were strong reactions. Some people complained about taxes or regulations implemented under assumptions that now seem overstated. That frustration is understandable, but if you step back, the bigger picture is humans are still here, and we're capable of adapting. We've done it before. The challenge is implementing solutions that are rational and scalable, not panic-driven. The point Gates is making aligns with what some climate analysts and realists have been saying for years, people like Judith Curry, Steve Koonin, and others who emphasize that climate change is serious, but not existential. They were often marginalized or censored for expressing these ideas, and now it seems the mainstream is slowly catching up. And that's an important lesson. Focusing too narrowly on carbon and emissions, without considering human welfare, can sometimes distract from solving real problems. Yes, the planet is warming, that's undeniable. But humans are adaptable. We have technologies and approaches that can help us thrive in a changing climate. That perspective is missing too often in public discourse. Too much emphasis on fear or alarm can obscure the actual tools we have to improve outcomes. So when you think about climate solutions, you have to prioritize human welfare, practical innovation, and scalable strategies. That's where I see the real path forward. So, thinking about the reaction from climate activists, it's understandable. People have dedicated their lives to this cause, and when someone like Gates, who's been highly visible, shifts his framing, it's bound to cause friction. But the way I see it, the goal shouldn't be about maintaining an ideological narrative. It should be about asking, what actually improves human lives? How do we reduce suffering and risk? That's the lens we should use, even if it's uncomfortable for some to hear. And when you look online, the responses are intense. There are people asking, almost rhetorically, do we get a refund for all the taxes and regulations that were based on these assumptions? That kind of frustration is, I think, a reflection of broader concern over policy decisions made with limited perspective. But at the same time, it highlights the need for clear evidence-based discussion. Panic and outrage rarely lead to productive solutions. Rational, scalable approaches do. Now, Gates's point, that climate change is serious but not existential, aligns with what some scientists and analysts have been saying for years. People like Judith Curry, Steve Koonin, and Alex Epstein have been emphasizing that while the planet is warming, it doesn't automatically mean the collapse of human civilization. That position was often marginalized, criticized, or even censored in public discourse, which is unfortunate. The evidence and reasoning were there, but the conversation became dominated by fear, rather than careful analysis. And that's where perspective matters. Climate change is real, it's measurable, it has consequences. But framing it as humanity ending distorts priorities. It distracts from other critical issues like poverty, disease, and global inequality, problems that have always posed more immediate threats to human welfare. That's not to diminish climate risks, but to contextualize them properly. It's also a reminder that innovation is our strongest tool. Technology has historically enabled humans to overcome significant environmental and societal challenges. From advances in agriculture to energy systems to medical science, adaptation is part of what makes humanity resilient. So when we talk about climate change, we should be asking, what are the solutions that actually scale? How do we maximize the benefit for humanity while mitigating environmental risks? That's the real conversation, and it's where Gates's framing makes sense. The truth is, this conversation about alarmism versus realism has been ongoing for decades. Some people were called alarmists, some were called skeptics, but the core point is, we need solutions that work in practice, not just rhetoric, and focusing obsessively on one metric, like carbon emissions alone, can sometimes obscure the bigger picture. We need to integrate climate action with economic development, healthcare, energy access, and innovation. That's the kind of approach that has a meaningful impact. What I find interesting is the way human perception works in these discussions. Extreme scenarios tend to dominate headlines because they grab attention, but that doesn't necessarily make them accurate or useful for decision-making. Humans are adaptable, creative, and capable of responding to challenges we can anticipate. So while it's important to recognize climate risks, it's equally important not to exaggerate them in ways that paralyze action or misdirect resources. Ultimately, Gates is reinforcing an idea that's often overlooked. Climate change is not the only problem, and it's not necessarily the largest one. Humans have survived, thrived, and innovated through dramatic environmental and societal changes throughout history. That perspective should shape how we talk about risks, investments, and priorities. Innovation, research, and practical problem solving, that's where progress happens, and that's how we make a difference for billions of people worldwide. What I find particularly notable is that Gates acknowledged the work of climate realists, people who've been saying for years that while climate change is a serious problem, it's not existential. Analysts like Judith Curry, Steve Koonin, Alex Epstein, and others have consistently pointed out that the obsession with carbon emissions alone can distract from solving the real challenges humanity faces. That perspective is valuable because it reminds us that adaptation and practical solutions matter as much as mitigation. There's a tendency in public discourse to demonize anyone who questions extreme projections. Scientists and commentators who offered measured assessments were often ostracized or censored. Social media, protests, even career pressures have been used to push people out of the conversation, and yet those voices were grounded in data and reasoning. Gates' recent framing aligns with that approach, looking at climate change as a serious issue, yes, but within the context of human adaptability and innovation. And that's where it becomes clear why human welfare should always be the lens through which we evaluate these risks. Yes, the planet is warming. Yes, there are environmental consequences. But if the policies or actions we take to address climate change undermine economic stability, access to energy, or basic human development, then we're not really solving the problem. That's a nuance that often gets lost when the discussion becomes purely alarmist. I also think about the way society perceives risk. Extreme predictions grab attention. They get repeated endlessly, and that creates a sense of urgency, sometimes justified, sometimes exaggerated. But urgency without a practical roadmap rarely leads to solutions. Humans excel when we can innovate and plan based on reality, rather than fear. That's why it's important to separate genuine risk from alarmism and focus on scalable, implementable solutions. Gates' shift is a good example of reframing the conversation. Instead of presenting climate change as an imminent apocalypse, he emphasized human resilience and the ability to adapt. That's not denial, that's realism. And realism is what we need if we want to actually make progress. It's a reminder that solving global challenges isn't about ideology, it's about evidence, strategy, and execution. This also ties back to technology. Humans have always relied on innovation to survive and thrive through change. Agriculture, transportation, energy, each leap forward has allowed us to manage environmental challenges that would have been catastrophic in a different era. Climate change in that context is just another challenge. It's significant, but it's not insurmountable. We have tools, we have minds, and we have systems that can be scaled to meet these risks. And so, the conversation should shift from fear to action. How do we apply resources most effectively? How do we ensure that communities, especially the most vulnerable, are protected? How do we leverage technology to not just mitigate climate impact, but also improve lives globally? Those are the questions that matter. Alarmist narratives might get headlines, but they don't solve problems. Innovation and rational strategy do. Finally, when you step back and look at the broader context, Gates' point underscores something fundamental. Humans are capable of adapting. The planet will change. We will face new challenges. But history shows we have the capacity to overcome them. That mindset, focusing on solutions, prioritizing human welfare, leveraging innovation, that's the real path forward. Climate is important, but it's one piece of a much larger picture. And it should be treated as such. So, when you think about it, the big takeaway here isn't about blame or politics. It's not about who said what first, or who changed their mind. The important thing is understanding the actual risks, the real opportunities for solutions, and how we can use our ingenuity to address them. Bill Gates' recent framing is helpful because it reminds us that climate change, while serious, is not a threat to human existence. That allows us to shift the conversation from panic to practical action. Humans have always adapted. We've faced resource shortages, environmental change, and massive societal shifts, and we've survived and thrived. That's the pattern. And it's why I often focus on innovation and long-term thinking. Technology is not just a tool, it's how we expand our capacity to handle uncertainty. Renewable energy, advanced manufacturing, sustainable agriculture, these aren't just buzzwords, they're mechanisms for creating resilience. And resilience, in my view, is the most important factor in addressing any global challenge. Another thing to consider is perspective. A lot of the public debate treats climate change like an existential catastrophe that must dominate every policy discussion. But that's not the most useful approach. When you look at human welfare as the primary lens, it changes priorities. Poverty, disease, access to clean water and energy, these are immediate threats that affect millions every day. Climate is a part of that, but it shouldn't overshadow the fundamentals. By integrating climate solutions with broader human development, we can achieve much more meaningful impact. I also think the Gates example is a reminder of how science and reason can correct narratives over time. People who have been advocating for measured, evidence-based perspectives, climate realists, have often been marginalized, and yet the data supports their point. Humanity is not on the verge of collapse due to climate change. That doesn't mean we ignore the science. It means we approach it rationally, with innovation and planning in mind. That's the mindset that produces results, not fear or ideology. At the end of the day, what matters is execution. It's about applying human ingenuity to solve problems. That's what history shows works. Alarmist rhetoric might capture attention, but it doesn't create solutions. Real solutions require understanding the problem, designing scalable interventions, and prioritizing the most impactful actions. That's how we improve lives globally, and that's the lens through which climate change should be addressed. So my takeaway is this: climate change is real. Yes, it will have consequences. Yes, but it's not the end of humanity, and it doesn't have to be a barrier to progress. By focusing on practical innovation, resilience, and human welfare, we can navigate this challenge and others that will come successfully. The path forward is not panic. It's strategy, creativity, and execution. That's how humans thrive, and that's what we should be working toward every day.